Far Cry. It's a name most gamers recognize, and if you grew up in the 2000s, there's a good chance you've had the opportunity to play one of the many iterations of the game. With Far Cry 6 set to release on October 7th, 2021, I thought it would be fun to try out something new here on the channel. Hey there friends, it's Kodiak here, one half of the team behind Legacy Gaming, and today we're exploring the world of Far Cry 6 to try and discover if it's the next big game. There's no doubt that Far Cry has had a long and illustrious run as one of those monolithic video game franchises that has dominated the last couple of decades. The formula, well, it's changed a bit, but at its core, the foundation of the game has remained rock solid. A protagonist caught in the middle of a desperate struggle, a plethora of over-the-top weapons, some friendly faces along the way, and oftentimes a larger-than-life villain that dominates the story and drives the entire experience forward. If we look back in time, this is a pretty consistent formula, but to really understand where we're going, we have to look at the last place we've been, and in this case, that's Far Cry 5. Set in Montana, it was a wild departure from the previous exotic locations of Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4. A religious cult run by Joseph Seed checked off the over-the-top villain box, and the explosions were at an all-time high. That tried and true Far Cry experience was on full display, and for most people, it worked just fine. The game scored decently well with reviewers and players alike, but it's the flip side of that coin I'm really interested in, the people that didn't like the game, and the common threads that connect their opinions together. The first thing you'll notice if you thumb through the bad reviews is the phrase, "the story is boring." It pops up countless times, and reflecting back on my time with the game, I've managed to break down that broad phrase into some more specific examples. The first issue, in my opinion, is the protagonist, a mute, generic law enforcement type that is as boring and blank as a sheet of paper. Storytelling is a two-way street. There has to be give and take, and a dialogue to create those meaningful moments. And because you're essentially mute, those moments happen around you, and while they often involve you, you never feel the weight of their impact. This forces other characters in the game to carry the burden of the story, and while bad guys like Voss, Pagan Min, and Joseph Seed are all plenty memorable and dynamic, even their oversized personalities can't carry the weight of the entire story alone. Now let's pivot briefly and look ahead to the future, where we're going with Far Cry 6. One thing is clear, that lifeless, mute protagonist, that is a thing of the past, and it solves one part of a major issue many took grievance with in Far Cry 5. Far Cry 6 introduces players to Danny Rojas, and for the first time in the series, players will take control of a main character that is a fully realized, animated, and voiced persona. This is a fundamental shift away from the Far Cries of the past and opens up that two-way road I mentioned earlier. And I think it's all aimed at solving that one major criticism, a boring story. Of course, this one change won't solve that issue alone, and there are other facets to explore, but this is the biggest departure from the methodology of the past. A lot of the other guiding principles are still in place, albeit elevated. Far Cry 6 will feature a larger-than-life villain, Anton Castillo, who, for the first time in the series' history, will be brought to life by a high-profile actor, Giancarlo Esposito. Not just the voice, but the likeness of Esposito will bring this ultimate villain into fruition, and this is phase 2 of Ubisoft's plan to create a more compelling and hopefully less boring story. The final piece of this particular part of the puzzle is of course the writing. Narrative director Navid Kavari, who has worked on Far Cry 4, 5, and 6, is at the helm this time, and while nothing is certain, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone more equipped to lead the story for a Far Cry game. That's not to say the writing will be any good, but we do know, thanks to a Reddit AMA, that more resources are being dedicated to the campaign mode this time around. Things like a map editor and arcade mode will not be part of the Far Cry 6 experience, and that means a more focused approach to the story. While this may sound ridiculous, when Far Cry's writing works best is when it intersects reality. And yes, I know Far Cry has never been a realistic game in the traditional sense, but when the developers blur that line and create those profoundly human moments, it works. Historically, this works best when the series doesn't pull any punches, something Far Cry 5 did way too often. This time around, Far Cry 6 is leaning heavily on historical influences to shape the game, most specifically, the revolutionary past of countries like Cuba. Everywhere you look, you see these influences, and even though we've only seen a few trailers so far, that reality seeps into every frame of those short videos. So as you can see, where we were is very much influencing where we're going, but a good story alone doesn't make a great game, and while things are definitely moving in an interesting direction, we still have miles to go before we can answer the question, is Far Cry 6 the next big game? When you think Far Cry, you think big, beautiful open worlds, and at this point, if you don't know that's Ubisoft's bread and butter, well, you probably haven't been around the gaming world much of late. We don't need to go back far into the history of Far Cry to see the writing on the wall. Far Cry 5 was the biggest game in terms of map size and playable area, and that makes sense given the massive setting, Montana. Far Cry 6 has already been confirmed as the biggest map in the series, but here is where we run into our second potential pitfall, equating size with success. One of the most common complaints we've seen when covering open world games is that the world feels lifeless or empty, and that often has to do with the world not feeling lived in. Enter Cyberpunk, and the promise of a world teeming with NPCs that have fully fleshed out life cycles and would be an integral part of the world environment. And well, we all kind of know how that turned out. Far Cry 6 will feature the game's first ever major city, and this presents a whole host of opportunities and challenges for the developers. How do you make a city feel alive? Well, the revolution definitely helps, and if the streets are crawling with soldiers and tanks, that ends up being okay, to a point. Esperanza, the city, offers Ubisoft a unique opportunity to create a different dynamic within the game, something they really haven't had the chance to do in previous installments of the franchise. Sure, you can redesign some towns in Hope County, Montana, and you can probably do the same on Yara, but adding a complete Manhattan-style city into the mix, well, that is certainly something different. I have no doubt that most of Yara will feel familiar to players. The Ubisoft team has extensive experience with similar settings from their previous games, but for the first time, the devs are going to have to think multidimensionally when it comes to the world. We're not talking one biome here, we're talking multiple, and that's no easy task to pull off. Consider also that a bigger sandbox gives the developers the opportunity to copy and paste more liberally, and players will pick up on this immediately. It's never something we're going to see or experience ahead of launch, but Ubisoft has done this and will always do this. It's just a matter of how far they take it. World building has always been a Ubisoft strength, and whether or not you're willing to admit it, they are skilled when it comes to establishing game worlds, and from everything we've seen, Far Cry 6 looks to take inspiration from the old and also draw upon the new. It's a double-edged sword, but it's one of the things I'm most confident Ubisoft will be able to pull off. Our final stop today is, of course, the gameplay, the centerpiece of any video game ever. Bad writing can be overlooked. An empty world, well, you can push past that. But if the gameplay isn't there, Far Cry 6 will certainly not be the next big game. If you read any review from the past couple Far Cry games, you'll know one thing: the gameplay has rarely changed. Sure, there are new bells and whistles, but for the most part, the gunplay has remained good, the AI has remained functional, and that Far Cry experience that was established back in the early 2000s has rarely changed. So what is changing this time around for Far Cry 6? Because those new features or new evolutions of existing features is going to play a major part in how people react to the game. The first is the choice to play as either a male or female protagonist, Danny Rojas. This is a first in the Far Cry series, and while Ubisoft has done this in other games, this simple option is a big deal for a lot of players that are just looking for a bit of themselves in the modern games they play. Second are the guns themselves. Far Cry 6 looks to offer the most over-the-top weapons we've seen in a major Far Cry game, and that includes things like an engine-powered minigun and a weapon that fires CD-ROMs as little silver saucers of death. Add on to this the tease of a potentially robust crafting system, and guns become an even more important part of the experience. Let's not forget, Ubisoft does have a tendency for creating crafting systems that require insane amounts of mind-numbing farming, but that's not to say they're incapable of making something interesting. And with less limitations and more ridiculous weapons in the mix, there's a lot of freedom to get things right here. At the end of the day, a gun is a gun. It fires a projectile and kills the bad guys. But we all know that weapons in video games can be far more visceral than that, and simple changes to physics or the dynamics of a weapon can create for some absolute carnage, and that's a good thing when it comes to a Far Cry game. Since we're talking weapons, we might as well touch briefly on a new backpack system within the game as well. We've already seen the likes of a flamethrower, a jetpack, and a missile launcher, and this adds another layer of depth to that chaotic combat we've come to know and love from Far Cry. Mobility is often a huge factor in how players experience a game, especially an open world one, and if things like jetpacks are starting to seep in, well, let's just say things could get interesting. Again, it's all about layering the experience, and to recap, we've already got over-the-top primary weapons, and now we've got this backpack weapon platform that continues to pile on with the insanity. Now, in an open-world FPS, guns are important, but one aspect of open-world games that is usually a sticking point for fans are the quests and side content. Unlike previous Far Cry games, Far Cry 6 offers players almost complete freedom to go and do whatever they want right from the very beginning. That's already been stated by the developers. This is an important distinction, but doesn't really inform what sort of activities players can expect as they travel across Yara. We've seen snippets of fighting and even some more minigame type content in the form of dominoes, but what about everything else in between? Repetition, boring objectives, poor rewards, there are landmines everywhere when it comes to open world content. The real question is, which direction will Ubisoft go? Will they lean into the past and create the same type of Far Cry experience players have come to know and either love or hate? Or will they venture off into new territory, something akin to how side quests were handled in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, mini story arcs that tried to bust out of the mold of boring and basic, oftentimes succeeding? My gut says it's going to be somewhere in between. Will we be blasting our way through outposts? Absolutely, that's a given. But for a game that's still a few months away, the team is going out of their way to really sell the experience to players as the most evolved Far Cry game to date. Until people go hands-on, no one will know for certain, but you better believe this is one aspect of Far Cry 6 that will either make or break the title. There are plenty of lesser factors in the mix here too, those supporting ideas that help prop up the gameplay and fill in the gaps around the major concepts. Things like travel and transportation in custom vehicles, and companions, animal sidekicks that work alongside you to take down enemies. These are just two of the systems we've already seen in action, and if the major set pieces were the outlines, these lesser systems are the color, helping define the gameplay. At this point, there are still multiple months leading up to the launch of Far Cry 6. With only our first real taste of the game, there's plenty more to unpack. More systems, more information, and more Far Cry 6. So at this point, what do you think? Will Far Cry 6 be the next big game? This entire video and concept was built around player feedback, and I think it's only fair that player feedback helped determine the answer. Leave your thoughts in the section below, and let's really unpack what Far Cry 6 means for the video game landscape in 2021. If you guys do enjoy this video, please do let me know. It's a brand new project here on the channel, and we'd love some feedback. If this is a series you'd like to see us continue in the future, hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. These long-form videos take a lot of time and effort to produce, and your feedback is critical to getting it all right. Finally, if you like what we're doing here at Legacy Gaming and you want to support us even more, you can now do so by becoming a member. For just a couple bucks a month, you're helping evolve the channel and take our community to that next level. Check out the join button below to learn more. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.